Well, hello everybody, and once again, let me welcome you back to our journey down the road to somewhere. And for those of you that are actually watching this on the day that we're shooting it, which is November 11th, it's Veterans Day, and I wanted to make sure, and just to all the veterans that are out there, just to tell you how much we appreciate your service, and want to acknowledge that this morning. Also, I was thinking that if while we're taping, you hear a big roar, there are a group of F-16s that are supposed to do a flyover this morning for Veterans Day, so we will just keep going, but know that that's what's going on over us, which is kind of cool. You know, it's been a big week since the last time that we taped. We tape on Mondays, and if you think back over last week, first of all, we had a major presidential election, and obviously, depending upon which party you happen to belong to, you're either ecstatic or trying to figure out what country you're going to move to. But the next 4 years are really I think they're going to be quite different. We're going to see a lot of changes just because of the way the election came out. Here in Denver, we had 2 feet of snow at our house, and we're kind of stuck in there for a day or so. So we went right from I don't know if we had much fall. It seems like we went right from summer to winter, but it was quite a storm. And then last week I had a birthday. It was my 75th, which I think means that I have now officially entered middle age, or something like that. Anyway, it was a big week here, so don't know what your week was like, but we're back to our time, hopefully, with the objective of getting you not only having a little fun going down Route 66, using my book, The Road to Somewhere, as our guide, but also giving you some sort of exposure to every book in the Bible. And ultimately, the hope is that after you watch our little intro video here, that you'll go over and actually watch the video of the teaching on the book that is attached to where we stop on Route 66. So we're in season 4 of our route down our journey down Route 66, and we're in the state of Oklahoma. This is episode 4 of 5 of the first part of going through the prophets, and so we have another week in what are called the major prophets, and I'm calling today's little episode God's Wild Prophet, because it's the book of Ezekiel that this stop is attached to, and I've got to say, I think it's one of the wildest books in all of the Bible. It does have a lot of revelation in it, and Ezekiel was just a wild man, and God had him gave him some pretty wild visions. So we'll talk a little bit about that, but that's where watching the longer video is going to be really important. One of the things about Oklahoma, and we'll talk about this a little later, but make sure you take a look at the guy on the right-hand side there, because he plays a big role in the history of the state of Oklahoma, and we will get into that as we move along too. So we're still kind of up in this upper right-hand corner of the state of Oklahoma. We'll be moving down along Highway Route 66 in the next particularly the next part of this season. And last time we were in the town of Afton, which was one of those towns that kind of got devastated by I-44 when it bypassed it. We're going to go about an hour down the road to Claremore, Oklahoma. And by the way, look up just a little bit up and to your left, you'll see a town called, I don't know how to pronounce it, Ulago. Anyway, that's going to come into play in just a little bit too, but just notice where it is in relationship to Claremore. Our book last week was the Book of Lamentations, which some have called the saddest book in the Bible, and it was really Jeremiah's reflections on the destruction of Jerusalem and the exile of a mass of the population to the Babylonian Empire, sometimes actually referred to as the Babylonian captivity. Today, as we go through Claremore again, the prophet that is attached to this stop is Ezekiel, and I might just say that Ezekiel, he overlaps chronologically both Jeremiah and Lamentations. Part of Ezekiel begins before the destruction of Jerusalem. The mass of the book really takes place after, but in terms of chronology, he would overlap both Jeremiah and Lamentations a little bit. One of the things about the major prophets, by the way, is that the first two major prophets, Isaiah and Jeremiah, their prophecies take place before the destruction of Jerusalem. And the last two prophets, which are Ezekiel and Daniel, are prophets whose visions and prophecies take place from exile in Babylon. And that's true of Ezekiel. So what we'll be looking at today are visions that God gave Ezekiel while he was in exile in Babylon. So that's where he will be prophesying from when we get into that part of our episode. So a little bit about Claremore, again, about an hour from Afton on the road. In the book, Joy drives this leg of the journey in this awesome kind of resto mod Corvette that they're driving Route 66, along Route 66. And while she's driving, John is kind of briefly catching up a little bit on Ezekiel and Daniel, and then they hit the town of Claremore. Claremore is a little bit larger town. You know, Afton last week only had a population of about 764. The largest town that we've been through so far in Oklahoma was Miami, which was about 19,000. About 13,000 population. Claremore is about 20,000 its population, and what Claremore probably is best known for in terms of both its personal history but also Route 66 history is that it was the home, the adult home of Will Rogers. Now, some of you know who Will Rogers was. Some of you might have no idea who Will Rogers was, and I think that probably if you asked most high school, grade school, middle school, kids today, what do you know about Will Rogers? Most of them would have no clue. But in the 20s and 30s, Will Rogers was literally the most popular man in America. He was a huge celebrity. He was an actor, he was a humorist, he was a writer, and ultimately what he was sort of a social commentator. But when you put all of the pieces together, some have said he was much like Mark Twain was in his era. He was in 71 films. About half of those were when films were silent before sound was invented and put into movies. And he was so popular that Route 66, the highway, was actually named in 1952. The name of the highway was changed to Will Rogers Highway. And then when the interstate, I-44, came along across Oklahoma, it's known as the Will Rogers Turnpike. For those of you that live in Colorado, one thing you might not be aware of or might be aware of is that in Colorado Springs, there is a shrine called the Will Rogers Shrine of the Sun. And if you go to the Broadmoor and you kind of look up the hill, the shrine is up there, and it has I think it's a carillon that will, ring out at different times during the day. So we have a little bit of Will Rogers right here in Colorado. The other thing about Claremore is that Claremore is the town that the play and musical Oklahoma was based on. And originally it was a play that was written by a resident of Claremore called Lynn Riggs. And as you pull into town, Main Street in Claremore is actually called Lynn Riggs Boulevard. And she wrote the play, and then Rodgers and Hammerstein really made it famous by turning it into a musical. So Claremore has a lot of interesting history to it. And when John and Joy get into town in the book, Joy decides that she wants to shoot the video in front of the historic Will Rogers Hotel. This was a hotel, by the way, that had kind of fallen into really complete disrepair. There was, it probably would have got knocked down if it hadn't been declared a historical site. But back in 2016, a businessman from Texas bought this dilapidated old hotel and restored it back to actually nicer than original condition, and turned it into a resident, kind of a senior resident facility. So Joy decides that they will shoot the video in front of what actually is sort of this famous, well-known hotel. So John, in the book, John introduces Claremore, its connection to Will Rogers, and actually uses a couple of Will Rogers quotes. He has some very famous quotes. As a matter of fact, some of them are very funny, but they tend to be particularly about one political party, which I felt like, given the fact that there are some people that are upset about the election or grieving about the election, I thought it might be inappropriate to use some of those. But what his most famous quote is that I never met a man I didn't like, which really wasn't a humorous quote, and my understanding is that epitaph is actually, on his tombstone where he's buried. And one of the funnier ones I really liked was he said that when I die, I want to die like my grandfather, who died peacefully in his sleep, not screaming like all the other passengers in his car. So these were the kind of quotes that he would come up with, almost a little bit like Yogi Berra, I think, But anyway, he was so well known for all of these kind of famous statements. So John goes on in the book to tell a little bit about the connection between Claremore and the musical and the play Oklahoma. And then he segues into the Old Testament prophet that is attached to this stop, which, as we've said before, is the prophet Ezekiel, God's wild prophet. John tells a little bit about how Ezekiel was one of the exiles. He was actually a priest, and in the opening text, on the larger video, I have all of the text surrounding the things we're going to talk about this morning, but just by way of introduction, Ezekiel begins by saying, "In my 30th year, in the 4th month, on the 5th day, while I was among the exiles by the Kibar River, the heavens were opened, and I saw visions of God." And then the second and third verse, on the 5th of the month, it was the 5th year of the exile of King Jehoiachin, the word of the Lord came to Ezekiel, the priest, the son of Buzi, by the Kibar River in the land of the Babylonians. There the hand of the Lord was on him. Interesting, by the way, the first verse has Ezekiel speaking in the first person, talking about himself. Second verse is in the third person, someone talking about Ezekiel, as is true of many of the prophets. This was a book that was probably put together. Ezekiel's prophecies taken at a little bit later date and put together probably after the return from captivity. But it tells us a lot about him. It tells us, number one, he was a priest. And it tells us that he received his visions by the Kibar Canal. And that has some significance because unlike Daniel, who in exile was living in sort of an almost royal situation as part of a group that King Nebuchadnezzar sort of brought to himself and housed around him. The Kibar Canal was probably an irrigation canal, and so this tells us that in all probability that Ezekiel was living in what we would think of as a refugee camp along an irrigation canal. Text also tells us exactly what year these visions begin in, and because it was, I think, the 5th year of the final king of the final authentic king of Israel, Jehoiachin, who was carried into exile, actually prior to the time probably that Ezekiel has his visions. But probably this is a book that begins around 593 BC, and the visions tend to run for about 22 years. So again, they're compiled together into this one book in our Old Testament called Ezekiel. John tells his audience that the book is divided into 3 parts. What you'll find if you watch the longer video is that back when I taught that particular book of the Old Testament, that I think I divided it into 4 parts, but we'll look at it in the way that the book looks at it. And the first of those parts was this time that Ezekiel had these visions of God, and very unique set of visions. Not only is it a vision of God, but it's a vision of God's chariot that is being pulled by 4 heavenly beings that later on are identified as cherubim. A similarity they have to what Isaiah saw in his vision in Isaiah 6, which were probably seraphim. The seraphim in Isaiah's vision had 6 wings. The cherubim here in Ezekiel's visions had 4 wings, and then this chariot that is talked about as looking like wheels within wheels. Some artists have tried to capture imagery of it, and I think probably pretty hard to do. You do have on the left-hand side here a drawing of what the cherubim might have looked like. There's a 4th face you don't see, which would have been the face of an eagle. These, are also similar to some things we're going to see in Daniel, and also some things we'll see in the book of Revelation. One of the things that strikes me is he talks about over the chariot that he gives this vision of God, and again in the longer teaching you'll dig into that a little bit. But one of the things that strikes me is that God is mobile. Usually when we think of God or we think about heaven, we think about a fixed place, like when John in Revelation was caught up and had this vision of God in chapter 4 of Revelation. But here we see God moving around, and that he has this, kind of wild vehicle, you might refer to it as, and over the vehicle is a very similar scene to what you see in the book of Revelation. So he has this vision of God, and in that vision, in some of these earlier chapters, he has prophecies of judgment. So this is taking place pre-destruction of Jerusalem. So again, he has prophecies against Jerusalem and Judah, and then he has prophecies of all these different nations again that eventually are going to be exposed to God's judgment. So kind of the first part of the book again will have to do with these visions, and you'll enjoy reading that and listening to that if you listen to the longer teaching tape. Secondly, one of the things then, and this I would say is post-destruction of Jerusalem, is that Ezekiel is known as having visions of a restored Judah and Israel. And perhaps the most famous vision regarding that is that he is the one that has this vision of a valley filled with dry bones. And in the vision, we're told that these bones come back together kind of in skeletal form, and then they begin to grow flesh and ultimately skin. And so the dead are made to come back alive, and it is like a metaphor, visual metaphor of what is going to happen to Israel, that Israel in captivity will be like this valley of dry bones, but that God is going to revive it and bring it back alive. And then that kind of leads into the third part of the book, which has visions of the future. And one of the things that Ezekiel is known for is he has a vision of the future temple. And when you read that text, you'll see that it's much larger, and there's differences between that and the temple, what's called the second temple that gets built. So many scholars believe that here he's talking about a third temple, probably something that if there is a literal 1,000-year millennial would take place during that time. And then he also gives a description of how the different tribes will occupy the land, and he has the 10 lost tribes back occupying the land of Israel. So probably, again, this is a future dimension, things that have not yet occurred, and yet some of which could be occurring in our own times. He also is famous for chapters 38 and 39, where he talks about a coming invasion of Israel. And particularly, he talks about a nation to the uttermost north of Israel that in the end times will attack Israel and will be allied with a number of other countries. This is sort of in this in the graphic that you see, sort of some ideas about where these different entities were located. But the big thing about Ezekiel's vision is that when this takes place, this northern alliance that attacks Israel is just absolutely annihilated. And I talk about that in some depth in the teaching video also. So John kind of ends the video. He actually, after the video, makes some humorous observations about Ezekiel. You'll have to watch the video to see those. And again, this happens to be one of the chapters in the book, one of the videos that they film where he doesn't really push people towards watching that teaching video, but I want to do that since that's the objective of the book, is to try and get people to ultimately watch those videos and end up with a very good overview of the whole Bible. The whole book is just wild. And, again, I think maybe one of the wildest books in the Bible. So I hope you take time to watch the other video. I hope you take time to read the book. And so that kind of brings us up to our next stop next week. Just as a little bit of a spoiler, in the back of your mind, think about a big blue whale and the final major prophet, Daniel, which is a very exciting book. So we'll look forward to digging into all of that next week. So thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you then.